In early January, only weeks before Donald Trump assumed the American presidency, he held a press conference at his home in Mar-a-Lago, Florida, during which he explicitly laid out his goals towards American territorial expansion during his second term in office. Trump claimed during this press conference without evidence that the Panama Canal was being operated by China, that it was a mistake to have ever given the canal to Panama in the first place, and that America needed the canal for economic security. Then he also said that the United States also needed the island of Greenland for national security purposes, questioned Denmark's legal right to the territory, urged Denmark to give it up, and threatened to impose crushing high-level tariffs on Denmark if they refused to cooperate. And then, when responding to a question asked by a reporter at the conference, Trump very pointedly refused to rule out using the US military to acquire either the Panama Canal from Panama or Greenland from Denmark through force if they refused to negotiate. And since then, these comments have sent shockwaves around the world, as everyone has attempted to answer just how serious Trump's comments were or weren't. The president of Panama has since insisted that every last square meter of the Panama Canal is Panamanian, and that control over it by anyone else is completely non-negotiable. While similarly, the prime ministers of both Denmark and Greenland have insisted that Greenland is not for sale to America. And in a more subtle refute of Trump's comments at Mar-a-Lago, the recently crowned Danish king Frederick X ordered a new update to the country's royal coat of arms that more heavily emphasizes the position of the polar bear in the lower left, which represents Greenland's status within the Danish kingdom. So far, the battle being fought over who should control Greenland between Denmark, America, or Greenland itself has been fully contained to chat rooms across the internet. But in order to understand the context behind Trump's comments toward Greenland, and what could actually end up happening regarding the territory, it helps to start with some history and what makes Greenland so inherently valuable to the interests of the United States, regardless of who's actually in power. By this point, Trump himself has a long history of suggesting that America should acquire the world's largest island from Denmark, a territory that's roughly the same size as the whole of Western Europe. He first suggested that America should make an offer to purchase Greenland during his first term in office in 2019, which was politely but firmly rejected by the Danish government at the time, and only caused a light amount of tension between the two heavily allied governments. But America's interest in acquiring Greenland from Denmark goes back way further into the past than most Americans probably realize. Long before Donald Trump, while Denmark's roots in Greenland go even further back before the United States even existed as a country. The ancestors of today's Danes, the Vikings, discovered Greenland as an uninhabited island a very long time ago, sometime around the year 1000, and began settling it. But they eventually died out and abandoned Greenland around 450 years later, sometime around 1450. The ancestors of today's Inuit people in Greenland began arriving to the island around the same time as the Vikings were abandoning it. And then, 3 centuries later in 1721, Denmark began resettling Greenland again and incorporated the island as a colony of theirs. Greenland then continually remained as a colonial possession of Denmark for centuries, except for a brief period during World War II between 1941 and 1945, when Denmark itself in Europe was occupied by Nazi Germany, and the United States took it upon itself to militarily occupy Greenland to keep it out of Germany's hands. After the war ended, the United States turned Greenland's control back over to Denmark again, and Denmark further incorporated Greenland into their country by making the entire island a county of Denmark itself. By this point, the vast majority of Greenland's population were ethnically Inuit, and at the tail end of the decolonization era in 1979, Denmark finally granted Greenland its home rule and broad autonomy. Greenland gained its own separate parliament and full control over its own domestic affairs, including setting policy concerning any mining on the island, while Denmark still retained full control over Greenland's foreign and security policies without the need to consult the Greenlanders much themselves. Much later on in 2009, after voters approved a referendum in Greenland, the island and Denmark agreed on a new self-government act that provided a legal pathway for Greenland to eventually declare its independence from Denmark if they ever desired to do so. From then on through to the present day, Greenland has been permitted to host a referendum on ultimate independence from Denmark, that if passed by a majority of its voters, would then need to be approved by the Danish parliament. Now, throughout the past 300 plus years of Denmark's evolving level of control over Greenland since 1721, the United States has also frequently expressed its own interest in acquiring the territory for themselves. The US, of course, has established a very long history of expanding its territory in the Americas and beyond through purchasing new lands from other countries at often highly opportunistic times. The country purchased the enormous Louisiana territory from France in 1803 at a time when Napoleon feared losing the territory to the British and needed money to fund his wars in Europe. The US purchased Florida from Spain in 1819 after the territory had become a financial burden on the Spanish. It forced Mexico into ceding over more than half of their country's territory in 1848 for a bargain bin price after subjugating them during the Mexican-American War. And then the US further purchased what's today's southern New Mexico and Arizona from Mexico in 1854, as the country faced another potential American invasion and decided to sell the territory rather than fight again. In 1867, just after the US Civil War, the US purchased the Alaska territory from Russia at a time when the Russians feared losing the territory to the British coming from Canada during a potential war. And it was around this same time that Greenland also first registered as an official acquisition interest in Washington. The U.S. Secretary of State at the time of the Alaska Purchase, William H. Seward, also commissioned a report on the benefits that could be had by an American purchase of Greenland from Denmark. The report concluded that an American acquisition of both Alaska from Russia and Greenland from Denmark would be advantageous because it would apply pressure on the Canadians wedged in between them to eventually join the United States as well. So the following year in 1868, Seward entered into negotiations with Denmark to purchase both Greenland and even Iceland as well. But in the end, Seward never ended up making an official offer to the Danes at the time, because the US Congress had just rejected another treaty he had sponsored to purchase the Danish West Indies and the Caribbean. And after that, he figured they would reject an acquisition of Greenland and Iceland as well, and the idea was dropped. After that, the US forced Spain into selling the Philippines to them in 1898 after defeating them in a war. And they, of course, pressured Panama into selling them the Panama Canal Zone concession a few years later in 1903. After that acquisition, the US interest in further acquiring the Danish West Indies and the Caribbean increased significantly, because they feared that the islands could potentially come under the control of Imperial Germany instead of Denmark, who could use them as a naval base to threaten America's access to the Panama Canal during a wartime scenario. And so, in 1910, the then US ambassador to Denmark suggested a bizarre and complicated scheme to Danish officials, in which the US would trade the major Philippine islands of Mindanao and Palawan to Denmark, in exchange for both the Danish West Indies and Greenland. Then, Denmark would be able to trade the Philippine Islands to Germany in exchange for northern Schleswig in Europe, which at the time was a Danish-majority territory that was controlled by Germany. The offer appears to have never been seriously considered by the Danish side though, and it became a moot point following World War I anyway, after Germany was forced into just ceding northern Schleswig to Denmark. Nonetheless, the United States continued to remain interested in acquiring the Danish West Indies and Greenland, and in 1916, Denmark expressed that it would be willing to sell the Danish West Indies to America in exchange for the US recognizing Denmark's claim to the entirety of Greenland. The US ultimately agreed with this position and purchased the Danish West Indies the following year in 1917, which then became the US Virgin Islands, and the US also extended their formal recognition of Greenland as a territory of Denmark. During the Second World War, the US military stepped in to temporarily occupy Greenland between 1941 and 1945, to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Nazis. But as the world began moving into the new era of the Cold War, America's interest in Greenland became much more intense than it had ever been before. Greenland, you see, sits about precisely in the geographical dead center between Washington, D.C. and Moscow, and so it sits directly along the shortest possible flight path between the United States and the former Soviet Union. America now wanted control over Greenland for its security and military applications, because it could enable US bombers and missiles stationed there to most rapidly attack the Soviet Union, while it could also serve as America's front line of defense for detecting a Soviet aerial attack launched against the US mainland. Because of these applications, the US considered Greenland to be of enormous geopolitical importance at the beginning of the Cold War. And so in 1946, the US government secretly offered Denmark $100 million in gold bullion, or about $1 billion in today's money, for the purchase of Greenland. The US argued to Danish authorities at the time, as they similarly do today, that a sale of the territory to the United States would actually benefit Denmark as well, because it would prevent any criticism of US military bases being present on Danish soil, while it would also save Denmark from the costs of having to subsidize Greenland themselves. But the Danish foreign minister at the time rejected the offer, saying that while his country owed the Americans a great deal for their assistance during the Second World War, he felt that they didn't owe them the entire island of Greenland. But while Denmark didn't agree to sell Greenland to the Americans, they still recognized how important the territory was to them and essentially allowed the Americans to use Greenland for everything they actually wanted. Denmark and the US both became founding members of the NATO alliance in 1949, and in 1951, the two countries agreed on a treaty that allowed the US to build a massive new Air Force base in the far northwest of the island that became known as Thule Air Base. Thule then became one of America's most important overseas military bases during the Cold War. It enabled US reconnaissance aircraft a base to spy on the northern Soviet Union from. It also became a base from which American nuclear-armed strategic bombers could use to threaten the Soviet Union from, and early warning radar systems set up there enabled America to detect any potential nuclear-armed ICBMs that the Soviets fired over the Arctic Circle towards the US mainland. Greenland also became a major strategic component in America's Cold War naval strategy as well. The Soviet strategic nuclear submarine fleet based itself in the far northern port of Murmansk, meaning that if they sortied out from port towards the US East Coast, they would have to pass through the bodies of water between the UK, Iceland, and Greenland in order to do so, which became known as the GEOUK Gap. Ensuring that the GEOUK Gap remained closed during a potential hot war with the Soviet Union became a top military priority for the US in the Cold War, and it ensured America's continued interest in having at least some kind of military presence in Greenland. After the Cold War ended in the early 1990s, though, America's interest in Greenland dramatically plummeted for around 20 years as relations with Russia entered into a new, initially warmer phase. America's military presence and activity in Thule significantly decreased. But then, several compounding factors in the 2010s and the 2020s reignited America's long interest in Greenland once again. A renewed confrontational relationship began emerging between America and Russia again after Russia seized control over Crimea in 2014. And especially after Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in early 2022 that continues to this day. Russia began heavily remilitarizing their dormant Soviet-era naval bases in the Arctic, to the point where they now significantly outnumber the number of NATO bases in the Arctic. While the Russian North Sea fleet homeported in Murmansk remained the crown jewel and the nerve center of Russia's strategic nuclear submarine deterrent force. America's long interest in Greenland from a defense perspective became reinforced, but new interests and concerns developed as well. America's interest in defending the GEOUK Gap is increased in the modern world of the internet, and the valuable underwater high-speed cables that connect the world together in the digital realm. Two of these critically important underwater cables pass right by Greenland today. The Far North Fiber cable that provides the quickest direct internet connection between Japan and Europe, and the Leif Erikson cable that provides the quickest direct internet connection between Canada and Scandinavia. Moreover, if Russian submarines were able to pass through the GEOUK Gap undetected today and advanced further into the North Atlantic, they could threaten to sabotage the numerous high-speed internet cables that connect the United States to Europe, a risk that could compromise the delivery of information from America to Europe long enough to briefly paralyze US military forces in Europe during a Russian attack on, say, the Baltic states. As recently as 2020, Reuters described Greenland as a security black hole for the United States and its allies, reporting that its nearly 27,000 miles of largely uninhabited coastline was exceedingly difficult to properly monitor, especially for a small country like Denmark who spent decades underspending on their own defense. Since the end of the Cold War, Denmark continually spent less than 2% of their GDP on defense for decades, until the Russian invasion of Ukraine sparked them to finally raise it back to more than 2% by 2023. After granting Greenland their home rule in 1979, Denmark has still remained ultimately responsible for Greenland's defense, but has spent a very, very small force. As recently as 2020, Denmark only had 4 patrol ships, 4 helicopters, 1 single maritime patrol aircraft, and 6 dog sled teams assigned to the whole of Greenland, to patrol and defend an area that's roughly the size of Western Europe. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the US government has repeatedly demanded that Denmark improve their aerial surveillance capabilities over Greenland, and a study in 2022 by the US-based RAND Corporation suggested then that integrating Greenland into the coverage of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, would help to mitigate this. The old American Air Base at Thule has since been transformed into a US Space Force base that's now known as Patuxent Space Base, and it's also only grown in importance to the US military's strategic planning. The US military now operates several polar orbiting communications, weather, and imaging satellites that cover the northern hemisphere, and these satellites require a station that's down on the ground within the Arctic Circle for their consistent tracking, telemetry, and control. And today, the only 2 polar satellite operations facilities that the United States controls are Patuxent in Greenland and Clear in central Alaska. Thus, US if the US lost control over Pacific for whatever reason today, like, say, in the event of Greenland becoming independent from Denmark and then just telling the US to leave, America would be forced to rely exclusively on their base in Alaska for their continued polar satellite operations, which would leave the military with zero redundancy and fallback options to rely upon. But again, Denmark was still giving the US military everything that it asked of it concerning Greenland and remained a steadfast American ally, with its own understandable interests in Greenland as well. Denmark honored America's call to war in both Afghanistan and Iraq following the 9/11 attacks, and they lost 43 of their soldiers in Afghanistan, a higher loss per capita than any other member of the coalition suffered there, while 7 more Danish soldiers were also killed in Iraq. Denmark's geography itself is also extremely important for the confrontation with Russia, because Denmark controls the gates between the North Sea and the Baltic, and is better positioned than anyone else to bottle up the Russian Baltic Sea Fleet within the Baltic, especially with their competent and capable Navy and Air Force that's acquired dozens of modern F-35 fighter jets from the United States. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Denmark has also donated more than 7.1 billion euros of direct military aid to the Ukrainians, including the transfer of their entire arsenal of artillery shells and 19 of their F-16 fighter jets, making them among the highest per capita contributors to the Ukrainian war effort as well. Denmark's continued control over Greenland is important to them not only because they have more than 300 years of continuous history there by now, but also because Greenland makes otherwise small Denmark about 50 times larger than it otherwise would be, while it also grants Denmark, and by extension the European Union, their only coastline in the Arctic as well, which gives Denmark and the EU both a great deal of say on what actually goes on in the Arctic. Greenland is also the basis of Denmark's current sovereignty claim to the geographic North Pole, which is only rivaled by the much larger Arctic nations of Canada and Russia. And all of these nations' overlapping claims to the North Pole matters a whole hell of a lot more than simply boosting national pride and ego. As climate change continues to accelerate throughout the century, the permanent layer of sea ice that's covered the Arctic for all of human history will progressively shrink in size enough to the point where cargo ships will eventually be able to regularly traverse through it, especially with the help of nuclear-powered icebreakers. Greenland is geographically well placed between the Northwest Passage through Canada and the Northern Sea route along Russia, both of which should be largely opened up to large-scale maritime traffic through most of the year just by next decade. Even better for who ends up controlling Greenland in the future, the island's eastern shores sit directly along the proposed Transpolar Sea Route, which runs directly through the center of the North Pole. So far, the Transpolar Sea Route has been impossible to use for large-scale maritime shipping because the center of the Arctic has been permanently covered by thick sea ice, including during the summer. But some analysts believe that by around the year 2050, the Arctic sea ice will have retreated enough to make even the Transpolar Sea Route actually viable to use by the maritime shipping industry, which will change the way that the world trades forever because it will become the new shortest maritime trade route between both Asia and Europe, and between Asia and the eastern side of the Americas, saving thousands of kilometers of distance and huge amounts of money over the current trade routes through the Suez and Panama canals. And whoever ends up controlling Greenland will have the best geographic positioning possible to extend their own control and influence over this new trade route that will probably become even more valuable than the Suez Canal in the not-too-distant future. And beyond the future valuable trade routes running by Greenland that everyone's interested in, there's also the well-known treasure trove of Greenland's incredibly valuable mineral resources that everyone wants some kind of access to as well. The US Geological Survey maintains a list of 50 mineral commodities that are critical to the US economy and national security. At the present, roughly half of these critical minerals have their production dominated by China, including very key minerals that are important for modern technologies like gallium and germanium used in semiconductors, and graphite that's used in electric vehicles, batteries, and nuclear reactors. In total, according to a 2023 report by the Brookings Institution, roughly 60% of all the world's so-called rare earth elements that are critical for military technology and the green energy transition are currently being produced by China, while 85% of the world's rare earth processing is also done in China too, giving China a virtual monopoly on the supply chain of the raw materials that are critical for building the future and maintaining a technological military edge. But it's well known by this point that the largest supply of rare earth elements and critical minerals anywhere outside of China are just sitting there almost completely untapped by anybody in Greenland. When combining the already known and discovered deposits in the south and the east of Greenland, the island is known to be home to reserves of 43 out of 50 of the US government's critical minerals list. Among those minerals include probable world-leading massive deposits of both graphite and lithium, which are both critical to the production of electric vehicles. The production of both graphite and lithium are currently dominated by countries that are distinctly not the United States or Europe, with China producing 77% of the world's graphite and Australia and Chile producing nearly 80% of the world's lithium. Whoever ends up controlling and exploiting Greenland's graphite and lithium reserves will suddenly make themselves a world leader in both resources, and they'll secure a critical component of the global electric vehicle production supply chain, which probably on its own explains a great deal of Elon Musk's and Donald Trump's interest in Greenland. But beyond the graphite and lithium, Greenland is believed to also contain enormous deposits of other critical minerals too, like neodymium that's used for magnets in electric motors, terbium that's used for magnets in tanks, molybdenum that strengthens steel necessary for offshore wind farms, along with critical base metals like cobalt, copper, iron, zinc, and nickel that are used for all sorts of things. One single known deposit of uranium in Kavana Field in the far south of Greenland is believed to be the 6th largest uranium deposit ever discovered in the entire world, and it alone contains more uranium than has been discovered in the entire United States. And beyond minerals, Greenland is also believed to contain large amounts of oil and gas as well. An estimate from the US Geological Survey in 2008 suggested that untapped wells off the coast of Greenland could produce about 52 billion barrels of oil, which if accurate, would be equivalent to about 3% of all the world's proven reserves of oil currently. And it would place Greenland within the top 10 countries worldwide by oil reserves, roughly equivalent to the status of Libya. If they were hypothetically acquired by the US, they would dramatically increase the country's total oil reserves into 6th place globally, with nearly half the total reserves of the oil giant Saudi Arabia. Now, historically, despite Greenland having a veritable motherlode of resources, they've been extremely difficult to access and exploit. Greenland's terrain and environment is extremely harsh. About 4/5 of the entire island is covered by a permanent thick ice sheet that reaches up to 3 kilometers thick in the interior of the island. The population base of Greenland today is also very, very small despite its size. There's only about 56,000 people who actually live in Greenland, and they're scattered all around the island in several small towns, none of which are actually connected to each other by roads. The only way to travel between Greenland's towns is by flying between them, sailing between them, or sometimes taking a snowmobile or dog sled team between them, across an area that's the size of Western Europe. Building out the required infrastructure across Greenland to actually access and mine the island's resources at scale would be incredibly expensive, while none of the ports on the island remain ice-free for longer than a couple months out of the year either, meaning that the island's maritime exports would require icebreakers that would increase the cost of development even further. But as the world has grown increasingly interested in the sheer scale of the wealth of Greenland's resources, the pace of mining there has steadily increased. Only a decade ago in the mid-2010s, there were just 12 exploratory sites across the island where firms were drilling for resources at. Today, there's around 170 exploration sites where drilling is currently taking place. But there's also only one single active mine on the entire island for the moment, and that's where Greenland's current problems begin. Because Greenland has such a small population and virtually no industries to speak of, the availability of capital in the island is naturally going to be extremely small until they can actually get large-scale mining going off the ground. But in order to do that, they need a huge amount of capital to get the required infrastructure into place that they don't have and will never have on their own. This means that Greenland needs to acquire a lot of foreign investment in order to get their mining operations kickstarted. And it also means that historically, Greenland has needed to be supported and subsidized by someone from the outside in order to survive. Denmark, who still ultimately controls Greenland, has always filled that role for now. The Danish state provides roughly $500 million to Greenland per year worth of subsidies, which accounts for roughly 20% of the island's total GDP and more than half of the Greenlandic government's budget that finances the territory's employment, education, and healthcare services. Greenland is therefore highly dependent on Denmark right now and their subsidies to survive, despite most Greenlanders desiring their independence from Denmark today. Based on the most recent opinion poll from 2019, roughly 2/3 of the small population in Greenland support their independence from Denmark, and tensions between Denmark and Greenland had already been growing in the years leading up to Trump's recent comments. During the colonial era after World War II, when Greenland was a direct county of Denmark's, the Danish authorities pursued a policy of what they called modernization in the territory that has been increasingly coming under higher scrutiny recently. In the 1950s, 22 Inuit children in Greenland were taken from their families to Denmark to be raised as Danes, and then returned back to Greenland with the goal of fostering closer cultural ties. A few years ago in 2022, the Danish government formally apologized to 6 of those 22 children who were still alive, just before another colonial-era scandal came roaring back to the forefront of Greenlandic politics. During the 1960s and 70s, the Danish government carried out a birth control program in Greenland where thousands of Inuit women and girls had IUDs inserted, in many cases against their consent. The Danish government stated that the program was to control Greenland's birth rate and to prevent unplanned pregnancies and costs, and it was ultimately successful in halving the birth rate in Greenland within just a few years. However, several Inuit Greenlandic politicians have recently accused the program as having amounted to a genocide of their people, including the current serving Prime Minister of Greenland, who directly called it a genocide during an interview as recently as December of 2024. In 2023, Denmark decided to hold a 2-year public investigation into the birth control program that's brought the painful scars of the colonial past in Greenland into the forefront of the island's politics. 67 Greenlandic women have sued the Danish government as a part of the investigation, who say that they had IUDs inserted to control their pregnancies against their wills. And the overall investigation is set to conclude at some point this year in 2025. This whole investigation within the small community of just 56,000 people in Greenland has almost certainly contributed to a greater shift in the island's desire for independence from Denmark, led by a prime minister who is already very pro-independence. At a press conference on the 10th of January after Trump's comments, Greenland's prime minister plainly stated, quote, "We don't want to be Danes, we don't want to be Americans, we want to be Greenlanders," end quote. Greenland's next elections are coming up soon, and with the ongoing investigation into the colonial-era birth control scandal, the topic of independence from Denmark was already going to be the front and center issue. And now, Trump's comments about purchasing or acquiring Greenland have effectively thrown gasoline onto the pro-independence flames that were already burning there, whether Trump intended to do that or not. There are many people in Greenland who now see the value in playing Denmark and the United States off of one another. And as Greenland becomes increasingly important geopolitically in the 21st century, many Greenlanders want their final independence so that they can pursue their own foreign policy and diplomacy separate from Denmark, so that they can enter into their own deals with whoever they want. Greenland has the legal pathway to independence through holding a referendum, while other international law scholars have suggested that due to Greenland's prior status as a colony of Denmark's, they also possess the legal right to self-determination under the UN Charter, and could unilaterally declare their independence as well without asking the approval of the Danish parliament at all. The big issue is what would happen next. Without Denmark's annual subsidies, Greenland would immediately lose 20% of their GDP and half of their government's operating budget. Denmark and Greenland currently have an arrangement where if mining operations in Greenland start really kicking off, the royalties that'll be paid out to Greenland by the mining companies will be offset by reductions in Denmark's annual subsidies, which has always reduced the incentive in Greenland to actually speed up their mining operations. Because Denmark will reduce their subsidies as mining royalties increase, most analysts expect that Greenland wouldn't see any economic benefits to large-scale mining operations until around 20 years after they start, which kinda de-incentivizes them from really ever starting and incentivizes them to just stick with Denmark's subsidies and Denmark's political control instead, undoubtedly much to the preference of Denmark. Problematically for Greenland, even if they did get mining operations going in the country with the help of foreign investment, there's no clear way that it would ever benefit local Greenlanders beyond the direct government royalties. You see, in healthy mining economies, mining operations will buy their equipment from local companies and will process their ores with local companies, which will spur on wider local economic activity as a result. But in Greenland, this can't really happen because most of the locations of the discovered large mineral deposits are far away from the current population centers, while Greenland's own small population base simply doesn't have the skills or the numbers that would be required to operate the mines and provide for their equipment and processing. Greenland's tiny labor market is also currently extremely tight, with only 0.2% of the workforce that's currently unemployed and a whopping 43% of the workforce that's currently employed by the government. Greenland effectively just has no spare labor capacity available to work in any future mines, which means that like the sparsely populated Gulf Arab states did after they discovered oil, Greenland's only available option to actually exploit their mineral resources with mines that they require to actually be independent from Denmark or anyone else is by importing enormous numbers of foreign laborers. And because Greenland's population is so tiny, that has the potential to radically alter Greenland's entire demographics and society very quickly. According to Greenlandic officials, an average mine that'll be operated on the island will require around 300 experienced foreign miners to run, meaning that just a single mine with that many workers will increase the whole island's population by 0.5%. 10 mines will increase Greenland's population by 5%, and some government projections suggest that Greenland's population would more than double within just a few years of large-scale mining beginning. In other countries that had small populations but massive resources that imported a lot of foreign labor, like Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, the foreign laborer population is now orders of magnitude larger than the local citizen population is. And a similar fate would probably ultimately befall an independent Greenland as well. In the Gulf states, especially in Saudi Arabia, the massive importation of foreign workers that enabled the country to exploit their resources also resulted in the government growing rich in royalties that it lavished upon its own citizens, which resulted in most of their own citizens opting to work for the government or getting by on government handouts and killed the incentive for anyone to start their own businesses. Their domestic productivity collapsed and their dependency on the oil industry grew even more chronic with time. Greenland has effectively been a planned economy within the Danish realm for more than 300 years now. And because so much of the island's government budget and its GDP have come from Denmark for so long, the wealthier class on the island are the ones who have the closest connection to those subsidies. Patronage networks exist in Greenland as a result. And so, there is a substantial risk of rampant corruption taking hold in Greenland after it potentially becomes independent and welcomes massive foreign investment in mining operations. 56,000 people governing this island effectively, the presence of such an enormous looming financial windfall will be incredibly difficult to do and avoid corruption. It's been described by some analysts as being akin to a small town in America being granted the keys to the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. What do you think your town's council would do with that? And if deep-seated corruption takes hold in Greenland post-independence, which is likely, the immense wealth it stands to gain in the future will not only be wildly unevenly distributed amongst its population, but there's also the potential that Greenland would shift further into authoritarianism and into the orbits of China and Russia. And China and Russia acquiring privileged access to Greenland's critical minerals would effectively lock China's monopoly on the global supply of critical minerals for good, while it would also secure China and Russia's control over the valuable Arctic trade routes of the future, all of which would of course be completely unacceptable to both the United States and also to Europe. Thus, Greenland doesn't have very many truly palatable options ahead of it. It could choose to remain a part of Denmark despite the majority of its people wanting independence. It could become independent and lose their subsidies from Denmark, and then resort to large-scale mining to support themselves, which will radically transform Greenlandic society forever, with massive numbers of foreigners and a significant potential for corruption issues. Or it could seek to move away from Denmark and towards the United States through a variety of different means. Trump's suggestion of an outright purchase of Greenland, like America's territorial acquisitions of the past, is one of these options. The Economist came up with a recent crude valuation of Greenland that took into account its annual GDP of $3 billion, minus the island's public sector that's overwhelmingly subsidized by Denmark, and then assumed that Greenland's long-run economic growth trend continues, and America receiving 16% of the island's GDP in taxes per year, which is the current US national average. Their result was that Greenland was currently worth approximately $50 billion in a potential sale, which is only about 1/20th of the annual US military budget. If the US purchased Greenland directly from the Greenlanders and sidelined Denmark, they could afford to pay roughly every single resident who lives there $1 million in cash and make every Greenlander a millionaire in the process. If Greenland also sold the island to the Americans, it would bring with it the full weight of the American administrative, legal, and security systems to the island as well, which, at least in theory, would eliminate the currently high risk of corruption setting in there, and would also probably guarantee a much more equalized distribution of Greenland's looming mineral windfall than if they went at it alone. The same could be said for remaining a part of Denmark and courting foreign investment through them as well, of course. But the American counter-argument to that would be the billions of dollars it can immediately bring to the citizens of Greenland that Denmark simply can't afford. While the US would likely further argue that American control over Greenland would ensure a stronger NATO presence in the Arctic that Denmark can't maintain on their own, in a theater that's increasingly becoming a tense geopolitical showdown with Russia's rapid remilitarization over their side of the Arctic. Of course, the Danes and much of the rest of the world suspect that Trump's true motives for wanting American control over Greenland are far more simple and straightforward. Acquiring Greenland would be the single largest territorial acquisition made in all of American history, just barely surpassing the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 in scale that was made by Thomas Jefferson. Securing Greenland would cement Donald Trump's legacy in American history for all time to come. But if Trump is also successful at bullying a staunch American ally like Denmark into giving up its territories, it'll also permanently and catastrophically harm America's reputation around the world. And it'll cast grave doubts into the rest of America's allies around the world as well. While it would also give further legitimacy to Russia's territorial demands in Ukraine and even China's territorial demand on Taiwan. One more potential path forward for Greenland, America, and Denmark is to potentially explore the path of a Compact of Free Association, or COFA. The United States already has COFA relationships with 3 otherwise independent states in the world: the Federated States of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau. These 3 island countries are all independent, but they're given access to America's domestic programs through the COFA agreement like Medicaid, the US Postal Service, the Department of Education, the Federal Aviation Administration, FEMA, and many others. The citizens of the COFA states and American citizens are each fully free to live and work in each other's countries, while trade between the US and the COFA states is also duty-free. In exchange, the COFA states allowed the US military effectively open access to all of their countries' territories, and they agreed to prohibit access to other foreign militaries without explicit American approval. COFA citizens are permitted to serve within the US Armed Forces, while the US handles all of their international defense treaties and affairs. The 3 COFA states in the Pacific are effectively American protectorates, who still maintain their nominal independence, and their populations are also comparable to Greenland, especially the Marshall Islands at 42,000 people and the Federated States of Micronesia with 115,000 people, nearly double Greenland's population. Rather than buying Greenland or overrunning it through military force, another option on the table is the US offering Greenland to become another COFA state instead, which could preserve Greenland's sovereignty and their independence while also protecting them from the dangers of corruption, while still protecting America from Russian or Chinese activity on the island as well. A pro-independence member of the Greenlandic Parliament, Kuno Fenker, has even recently suggested that Greenland should pursue a dual COFA agreement with both the United States and Denmark after it declares its independence. But whatever option that Greenland ultimately decides to pursue, between remaining within Denmark, going completely independent, getting purchased and absorbed into the United States, or pursuing a Compact of Free Association agreement with the US and/or Denmark, the decision ultimately should rest with the Greenlanders themselves in a fair and open election and referendum. It's their island, it's their past that they're reconciling with, and it's their future that they're deciding how best to pursue. And it's their wishes that should ultimately be respected. Now, as a public figure who often makes videos here on YouTube about pretty controversial subjects, I used to have a big issue with data privacy, and I don't know about you, but I've also noticed a huge increase recently in the volume of spam calls and emails that I've been getting. That is, until I started using this video's sponsor, Incogni. You see, the reason that spam calls and emails have been getting worse recently is because of a thing called data brokers. These are private companies that collect and then sell your personal data that they scrape from publicly available records like electoral rolls and census reports. And there are hundreds of these kinds of data broker companies probably selling your personal information right now. These companies could have your name, phone number, address, shopping habits, and possibly even your social security number that's all available to the highest bidder. I know that when I checked myself, there were literally hundreds of different companies that had this kind of information up for sale to other companies, scammers, stalkers, or even worse. At best, this situation leads to scam calls and spam email, while at worst, it can lead to doxing or even identity theft. Data breaches are getting more and more common every year, and especially if you live in the United States, you straight up don't have any federal protection for these kinds of companies whatsoever. But this is where Incogni comes in to help. Incogni will fight on your behalf to remove your personal data from data brokers, and they'll deal with any objections that come from their side. All you've got to do is create an account and give them your approval to work on your behalf. Incogni will then carry out repeated ongoing removals because even if the broker removes your data once, they can always just collect it and then sell it again. Incogni will repeatedly fight to make sure that your personal information stays off of the market permanently. I know that when I signed up, it was horrifying to see how many brokers out there actually had my data. And it was so satisfying seeing Incogni getting them deleted one by one. And I've seen a huge decrease in the number of spam calls and emails that I've gotten since. So, if you'd like to give Incogni a try as well, you can do so by clicking the button that's here on your screen right now, or by going to incogni.com/reallifelore, where you can use the code reallifelore to get an exclusive 60% off of an annual Incogni plan. You'll also greatly be helping to support my channel at the same time. So once again, that's incogni.com/reallifelore and code reallifelore for 60% off of an annual Incogni plan. And as always, thank you so much for watching.